right. Can you guys hear me? I can't see you right now. It's like interrogation lights here. Not that I've ever been under any interrogation lights, but I've seen movies. All right, so just because you guys are funny, I gave you 2 QR codes. And because I like you, no, neither one of them are a Rickroll. One of them goes to the Amazon link for the book. The other one goes to the table of contents that I put out. So you can see if beyond what we talk about today, if what's in the book is something you think would be helpful. But the first thing I want to do to kind of keep in line with what everybody has said throughout this conference is this is such a family and a community. So I wrote a book, got a little bit crazy with it, ended up longer than I wanted it to be. It is about wireless security architecture. We're going to hit on a few things from this book today, just with like some key takeaways that I think will be helpful. But this book goes into everything from Wi-Fi and Radius and 802.1x and EAP authentications to risk and compliance, and then it digs into pen testing. We talk about IoT, we talk about private cellular, and that's a lot of stuff. So throughout this journey, I could probably point to almost everybody in this room that has helped me, and I've asked questions and other subject matter experts. So, Peter, I reached out to Peter, I don't know how many times about some rooming and key exchange stuff. I reached out to Keith. JD helped me with a lot of the thread and matter stuff and IoT. Troy helped me so much with some of the industrial automation. I reached out to Dan Jones for Apple stuff. I reached out to Landon for stuff. I reached out to Tani for stuff. I reached out to Sam for Cisco stuff. So it's really hard to cover a book that's not vendor specific. So this is vendor neutral, but it does talk about, what does Aruba do, how does Cisco do it, et cetera, et cetera. So I just want to say thank you guys, because the Slack group was really helpful, reaching people on Twitter DMs, having phone calls. Thank you guys all so much. And huge thank you, if you like what you see, to Stephen Orr, who was my primary technical editor. If you like yourself, I don't recommend doing that. The next time, I think I should maybe find somebody that's, 5 times smarter than I am instead of 200 times smarter than I am. But no, seriously, his contribution and everything from not Cisco so much, but the Wi-Fi Alliance and the security content there just made such a huge difference in the quality of what we were able to dig into with WPA3 stuff here. So huge thank you, not possible without the family. I have primarily a network security and information security background. So right now I do mostly enterprise security architecture. Does anybody work in an organization that has an enterprise security architect, or that is their job, or a team? I have to come up here so I can see. So I see 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 8 hands. So you guys understand what I do. For everybody else, it's you sit in the middle of kind of everything. And what you're going to see here is security is very holistic. So it's not just about configuring a wireless system. It's about configuring everything else around it, and making some mitigating controls and decisions around that. So this is a little bit of a journey that we're going to go on. Because I asked you guys specifically what you wanted to see, we're going to focus a lot on that SSID security piece. But I want you to understand the journey of, we don't start there as a security architect. There's a lot of stuff that happens before you even start thinking about planning what you're gonna configure on SSID with anybody's stuff. So this is the journey. We're gonna get into Lamborghini or Ducati and go through the first parts pretty quickly here. So the scoping part is first. Now, obviously in the book, there's an entire chapter about planning and scoping and questions to ask. But the first thing I do when I go, and this is easy when you're a third party, right? Like I'm not a full-time employee with an organization. I walk in as somebody that knows nothing. And so it's really easy to just ask a bunch of questions. But what I've found throughout this process is asking these questions early. I feel like when we get into, so a lot of times I'm sitting between the security team and the networking team, or the wireless team and the wired team, or the technical executives and then the non-technical stakeholders that have a vested interest in a project. And what I've found is that a lot of times when I go in and I'm working kind of with peer technologists, they want to just sort of do what they need to do this, have somebody sign off on it and move on to the next thing. And what I realize is that creates a lot of frustration and friction, because if you don't have that communication, as much as you don't want certain people's input into something, it's much better to have it early and work that in and factor that into what you're doing than to find out months down the road when you've already made a lot of decisions, possibly when the organization has already dumped a lot of money into it, that's not going to work. And I'll give you some examples of that. The other thing is to understand the organization's risk tolerance. Now, this can be kind of squishy. So again, in the large organizations where people were raising their hand a second ago, you guys probably have a mature risk management program. So risk management program looks at not just IT risk, but risk to the business of reputational risk, things like bad press releases and stuff like that. So it's kind of nice when there's an organization that has a risk management framework, because we're already kind of voluntold what to do within a certain amount of parameters. When you don't have that structure, though, you got to do a little bit more digging and investigation, based on what the organization's doing, based on what these networks are serving, the data that's accessible, the types of endpoints, and then any compliance stuff. So I like to nail this stuff in first, because these are kind of the hard or fixed requirements we're going to talk about. And that's my starting point. So the role of the technologist in risk and compliance. I feel like when we don't have this structure or this understanding, things get a little bit messy and they get pretty frustrating. So what should happen is the technologist or the other subject matter expert is going to inform the organization about risk and vulnerabilities. Whatever that may mean, that's very broad, right? So maybe they're telling you they want to connect a bunch of biomedical stuff, and it only supports WPA to personal. And you say, okay, so if that's the parameters we have to work in, here's the risk associated with that, here's the likelihood of the risk, and then here's what can happen based on what these systems are connected to if that does occur. So there's all of this evaluation of like, what's the likelihood, what's the impact, et cetera. The organization then, not us, tells us what their risk tolerance level is and what's okay. And then they'll help us make decisions around what resources they're willing to use to mitigate that. So meaning, we always kind of joke, like, don't protect a $10, like a $10 watch with $1 million alarm system. It's kind of the same thing with any type of network security architecture. So the organization's going to go, okay, that's fine. We understand the risk. So either monitor and mitigate that risk. Maybe we're going to buy something that's a mitigating control to reduce the likelihood of that happening. We may transfer that risk, which is something like getting, insurance, cybersecurity insurance, or other insurance, or they accept the risk. And that kind of those middle two bubbles is a little bit of back and forth, because there's this kind of delicate dance of, well, we could do this, but it's not a good idea, but here's why it's not a good idea. So there's a money conversation, there's a time conversation, there's a resource conversation. But at the end of the day, the organization says, I don't care, we're going to do this way, right? And figure it out. So having communication skills and being able to communicate outside of your own competency, being able to communicate in the business terms, and have those conversations with technical or non-technical stakeholders, and not getting so kind of blinded by what you're worried about as a technologist. Because sometimes there are entire organizations. Does anybody work in security like a lot, where you do risk compliance or audit with anything? I can't see under the lights here. Okay, no. So in some organizations, like with PCI, right, the payment card, there's a lot of requirements if you're processing credit cards about securing that data. There are organizations that just say, we're not going to do this one thing it told us to do. We understand we're going to get fined, and we've budgeted a line item for those fines every year. Because it is less for us to pay the fine than it is to put a mitigating control in for that architecture. And that's perfectly fine. Now we're sitting here going, well, dumbass, just, just fix it. But it's a business decision as to how much money and time and resources they're going to use to fix it or not. And then we design around that. Now I like to get things in writing, especially I've had customers make some very insecure decisions. And ultimately, at the end of the day, unless it's very, very, very bad, something as simple as an email that says, look, I'm advising you to do this, and this is why, and I'm specifically advising you to not do this, and this is why. I would like for you just to acknowledge that. Even as just in your own organization, don't be snarky, But you can write something like that. It's kind of a CYA. But, so let me ask you guys this. So what if you walk in somewhere now and somebody tells you they need to connect a subset of endpoints with web? What do you do? You guys must have been out late last night. I missed the party. What do you do? Ask why. Thank you. I've had so many people over the years that say, no, you work in security. You just tell them, hell no, that's not happening. Well, let me tell you something. When you walk in to a hospital and they've got a multi-million-dollar mass spectrometer, you're going to do whatever they tell you to do because they're not replacing the multi-million-dollar mass spectrometer. It's like that when you walk in anyway. Why? And how do we deal with that? So there's ways we can design and architect around it. We can segment those things. We can segment them over the air. We can segment on the network. We can put firewalls in place. We can be very granular. And we can really, really dial that stuff down. So I mentioned a second ago how those things feed the hard constraints. So I like to, again, it's kind of like when you're doing Wordle and you figure out, which letter, this letter definitely goes there, so you know that needs to stay there. There might be another one, right? There might be 2 E's or 2 T's, but that one's definitely going to stay there. So your hard constraints are your starting point, and you sort of massage everything else around that. The primary hard constraints, the 4 things that are kind of always going to come up during this conversation, are authentication, authorization, encryption, and then privileged access management. I've broken out privileged access management separate from authentication, even though they can be related, because I think this is a huge gap on the technology side. I have this conversation a lot. For whatever reason, organizations do a pretty good job when they have a lot of server infrastructures, microservices, when they're protecting the keys or the APIs between those. When we get into somebody having, SSH keys or kind of root level admin privileges on switches and routers or the wireless infrastructure or Active Directory and other domain services, for whatever reason, they just kind of let us all run crazy and free, right? How many of you guys have some type of password or SSH key or something saved on your computer somehow? Some way, shape, or form. It's either, So one of the things I get concerned about is I do a lot of consulting around malware and segmentation, stuff like that. The first thing malware does is it starts to skim and scrape every credential store on your computer. There are not very many that are resistant to what malware digs into. So if you have like a vault, a password manager vault, that's password protected, those are usually pretty good, not 100%. If you're storing things in Outlook and Outlook Notes and all of that, that's not good. If you have FileZilla because you're doing FTPs, it's gonna get that. So there's a lot of opportunity for a bad actor or automated malware to scrape these things off of computers. And pretty much any organization I go into, the IT teams have just free reign. And I get it, I came from that world. You want it to be convenient, you want it to be easy. This is something that's a huge gap right now and a risk with organizations, so I call it out. But pretty much every risk framework, and especially those that involve any type of compliance requirements, are gonna have specific line items that will be thou shalt. Thou shalt have strong authentication. Thou shalt have authorization and segmentation. Thou shalt encrypt at this level with this algorithm set and these key links. And thou shalt have privileged access management and least privilege and et cetera. The one thing I want to point out here, and this was funny when I was writing the book because we use authentication pretty loosely in IT and network security, especially wireless, because there's open system authentication and MAC authentication, all this stuff. In InfoSec and information security purposes and audit and compliance purposes, we consider authentication a validation of the identity. So something like a MAC address or a passphrase is an assertion of an identity, but we're not validating it. So it's not considered authentication. I'm going to come back to that later, but just let that sink in for a second. So beyond that, most compliance requirements are going to have mandates around certain types of testing and assessment. Pen testing could be internal, external, et cetera. So my next step, and obviously I'm cutting a bunch of stuff out because we're taking a 600-page book and we're putting it into 30 minutes. But the next thing I do is a kind of the holistic technical architecture. So, right, we understand what we need to do, we understand the mission, we understand the hard constraints, we understand what we need to authenticate, what we need to segment. So the next thing is, how do we design the entire holistic network around this? And again, this is not just Wi-Fi. This is obviously what we're doing between the endpoint and the AP. It's also between possibly the AP and the controller, if there's a controller, or a tunnel termination gateway, all the way through the network infrastructure, through switches, through routers, through firewalls, possibly out to the internet. And so I know you can't read this. I'm going to make, aside from this being in the book, there's a lot of stuff from the book I'm pulling out with Wiley's permission and making it available on a page on my blog. So you'll have access to this where you can actually read it. But the point of this is that all of the different inputs that are on the left are, what are the endpoint's capabilities? What are the network's capabilities? Are we bridging traffic locally to the switch? Or are we tunneling it all the way back to the controller? Because how we do everything, and I mean everything, how we do DHCP, how we do segmentation, how we secure and monitor that is different depending on that architecture you've chosen. And this is especially true as we're kind of working through, we had controllers, I don't know, I've been in wireless since the 90s, but it was pre-standard. So I've watched it go from like autonomous APs where they were basically like switches, to the really light dumb APs where they did nothing without a controller, to this hybrid where it's a controller but it could do both, to now we have cloud managed stuff, and now we have sometimes cloud managed or cloud coordinated, but there's some other on-prem component as well. So all kinds of stuff going there. The point is that when you look at these inputs and outputs and you start making decisions and drawing these lines, you can see that any one of the things on the left, there may be 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 little arrows going to an output on the right, which means if you didn't collect your requirements early with what endpoints needed to be on there, what are their capabilities, et cetera, you start fiddling with that later, you can see how this gets messy. The other thing I tell people, and this is reiterated in the book multiple times, is security does not happen in a vacuum. And that means all of the RF design stuff, take security out of it, everything else you guys do in Wi-Fi that has nothing to do with security has to do with security, and it's critical. There is also a section of this book that Wiley has approved me to pull out that is messaging to managers and executive leadership that are not technical. And it does things like say, when you don't put enough APs or you don't get a quality RF plan, your security is not going to work because you can't do things like FT. So now we have to downgrade security to deal with that. So there's a whole set of messaging there where you guys can take that and wave that in front of somebody's face and go, here. So the architecture planning, when we get it in a simplified version, really just looks like, what are we doing facing the endpoint? What are we doing within the wireless infrastructure? And then what are we doing on that back end with that network handoff? Okay, now the good juicy stuff that you asked for. And some of this I'm going to skip through. These are ugly slides. I'm going to admit to that. I like pretty slides. I did graphic design when I was little. But what I wanted to be able to do is have these be, like a takeaway where you could go read it later. So 3 classes of security, right? We have enterprise 802.1x stuff. We have passphrase-based networks, and then we have open and now enhanced open, like Wes was just talking about. So the one thing I want to point out is this is very confusing. So when I was logging into different products and getting screenshots, different places for the book, what I realized is it's complete chaos as to what they name it. Under further digging, what I have found is that with the Wi-Fi Alliance, they own the WPA brand here. So if the products aren't certified with the Wi-Fi Alliance, they're not allowed to use WPA whatever personal and WPA whatever enterprise, et cetera, et cetera. But the products are certified per product line. So what do you do if, I'm going to just pick on Aruba, what do you do if you've got Aruba 300 series and those are certified, but then the 500s aren't certified yet? So it's just kind of messy, and what ends up happening is sometimes the WPA2 stuff uses the WFA naming convention, but the WPA3 stuff does not. So here's a little cheat sheet. We're going to talk about the personal stuff and SAE versus PSK in a second, but you can kind of refer back to this and hopefully pick apart what a vendor means there. And then it's also depending on the platform. So like Cisco presents these options completely different than Aruba does, which is different than Mist, which is different than Extreme, et cetera. So there's different tiers of drop downs, right? So the main difference between these classes of WPA 2 and 3 is the use of protected management frames. So somebody was talking about protected management frames a few times earlier, and I don't remember who that was. But the interesting thing to me is there is no information element to differentiate 2 and 3. It is by virtue of the use of an endpoint using protected management frames, that makes it a WPA 3 endpoint. And that makes that connection a WPA 3 connection to the AP. So protected management frames do a few different things. They introduce, I have a slide on this, they do introduce a certain amount of integrity, which is just, are you actually the AP that you say you are, or is that being spoofed? Same thing with an endpoint, as well as encryption. There are certain frames that are certain frames that are encrypted. It does also have some downgrade protection, which is pretty cool. If you get confused, so the 11 WPMF is called Protected Management Frames by the Wi-Fi Alliance. It's actually referred to as Management Frame Protection in the IEEE standard. And just to further confuse things, Cisco already had something that's proprietary to what they do called Infrastructure PMF, which has nothing to do with this PMF. So just kind of keep that in mind when you see it and tuck it away. I try to keep the 11W with the PMF. That also gets confusing because, as you'll see, like with FT and 11R, 802.11r, which is that fast BSS transition, was initiated as an 11R substandard, but once it gets rolled into the 802.11 standard in whole, it sort of disappears as its own entity, and then it's developed within the standard. So if you look at an 11R document that's 2 years old, it does not reflect what's happening now. So the naming convention gets a little bit messy. This took some digging through a lot of papers. Thank you, Stephen. Thank you, Matthew Gass. Thank you, other people. The 802.11 standard is over 4,000 pages. So the PMF, you'll see here, there are some frames that are protected and unprotected. I'm going to say obviously, although there are people that have proposed being able to add security and integrity before the four-way handshake. But in the normal world right now, the four-way handshake happens, that's where that kind of trust relationship is established, and then after that is when we can start to protect these frames. And if you're just really interested in geeking out, down on the bottom right, you'll see there, so when the frames are encrypted, if it's the unicast that is using the PTK, they did add a new set of protocols and keys for the broadcast and multicast protection, and that happens now during the third part of that four-way handshake. All right, thank you, UC. Is UC here? He sent me this picture, so I had to add it in here. I told him I would. Okay, so WPA enterprise stuff. When we talk about 802.1x and the EAT methods, there's actually, so I chose a little bit different way to explain this in the book, and it's how I'm going to explain it to you right now. And of course, I can't do that right on here. Okay. I was going to draw for you, but it's in presenter mode, so I can't do that. All right, so I'm going to use my hands, and we're going to pretend, right? All right, so anytime we have this EAP stuff, what we have are these outer tunnels and then the inner tunnels, right? So everything you see on the, the left are the outer tunnels. These are all familiar terms, right? These are acronyms, these are letters you've seen before, okay. And on the right are those inner methods. What happens a lot of times, and the reason I mention this is most people that decide to use like PEEP and MS-CHAP v2, the radius rules are configured improperly. And what they're actually saying is we're gonna allow PEEP with MS-CHAP v2, and we're also gonna allow MS-CHAP v2 without an outer tunnel. I'm not gonna dive into that today, but this is why I mentioned this. So that EAP outer tunnel is kind of like establishing a VPN tunnel, right? It's just making a secure tunnel. These protocols, most of the networking protocols we've been using, weren't designed to be used over untrusted networks, and they're not encrypted, or there's some type of credential exposure. Same thing with radius shared secrets, not encrypted. SNMP V2C community strings, not encrypted. Some of these inner authentication methods are not encrypted or partially not encrypted. So like during a challenge accept exchanges, the username might be exposed. And so we don't want that. So what we do is we put it inside of a tunnel. We make this secure tunnel, and then it doesn't matter what we're passing through here so much. And so if I asked you guys to draw a line, probably everybody's going to go PEEP to MSChat v2, and then maybe TTLS to TLS. That's kind of the common thing. So again, the book kind of dives into the nitty-gritty details of this. These are all of these are good. All of these are good and secure. They are subtle little differences. PEEP is an encapsulation. When we get down into EAP, FAST, and TEEP, they do support chaining, credential chaining, which I'll talk about in a second. There's also some security, really detailed security vulnerabilities related to the cryptographic binding between the outer tunnel and inner tunnel. So it's almost like most of these protocols right now, it's almost like, what do you call it when somebody opens the door and you kind of follow through them? Like tailgating, yeah. So there's basically kind of opportunity for tailgating where the tunnel gets created and then a man in the middle or on-path attack can happen where somebody slides into that inner authentication. And so there's kind of development of these new cryptographic bindings to prevent that from happening, which is one of the reasons we like some of these newer outer tunnels. Also stuff like EAP TLS, we recommend you tunnel that because that supports deprecated protocols like TLS 1.0, and that is selected by the endpoint. We don't really, caveat, sometimes with Microsoft you can control that. But anyway, always do your outer tunnels and then pick your inner stuff. Somebody asked about credential chaining. I'm not going to go into this too far. These are the 4 ways you can do credential chaining. I did talk about this a little bit in my last talk here, which is 2020, as well as certificate chaining. But EAP FAST uses something like a little token that goes on the machine to do this. EAP TEEP is a standard. I absolutely love EAP TEEP. I'm like completely sold on EAP TEEP and infatuated with it. It has not had wide adoption. It's been a standard from the beginning. That is by far the most secure outer tunnel option if you have something that supports it. And then the other ways we can do it are with NAC or advanced radius servers where we can do logic statements. So Cisco ICE, Aruba ClearPass Policy Manager, Fortinet's Fortinac, Forescout, all of those things. Oh, okay. Oh, I added this in here because of Wes. I'm not going to dig into this, but when you guys look, you will notice that the selector in the second column, the hash algorithms vary depending on what type of network and whether or not fast transition roaming is in use. That is sometimes what breaks some of this roaming from clients. Okay, I'm going to completely negate what Wes said about using transition mode. Stephen Orr and I are very well aligned that we don't like transition mode, with the caveat that sometimes it needs to happen. So Falcor down here wants you to only use transition mode for as long as you have to and have a plan. So what I really want to impose on everybody is don't just go enable transition mode on these networks and then just kind of wait until some time in the future, which is not yet to be determined, to move out of transition mode. You are putting all of the endpoints at risk. Less so with enterprise networks, with 1X, way more so with personal networks. So one of the outcomes of the book is that I was talking to Andrew last night about his beacon overhead calculator. We've always been told collapse SSIDs, collapse SSIDs, collapse SSIDs, collapse SSIDs. Well, we're telling you, stop doing that. You've heard, some guidance around possibly separating based on bands. Stephen and I feel very strongly that if you want a truly secured environment, you will need to add more SSIDs based on the use cases of those. On Wi-Fi, broadcast traffic it's its own broadcast domain. So there's some vulnerabilities related to that. There's quite a bit of vulnerabilities related to MAB. There's a ton of vulnerabilities related to zero-conf. So MDNS, Bonjour, all of these protocols that were not designed to be used on enterprise networks are now being used there, and we're telling you to separate them. I'm running out of time, so I'm going to hit on this really quickly, but I want to drive this home. Let's stop calling passphrases PSK. So PSK and SAE are the mechanisms by which the keys are created for personal networks for the actual encryption. So before, it was a pre-shared key because what you typed in there for the passphrase was used as the encryption key. So if the passphrase was short, the encryption key was short, et cetera, et cetera. We don't have that with SAE. So I'm not going to get in the nitty-gritty details, but there is a derivation process that happens from the passphrase. The key length is divorced from the passphrase length, and each of the endpoints on that network, even if it has the same passphrase, will have their own unique key. And there are some other juicy fun things here, like forward secrecy. So you can't find out a passphrase and then decrypt that traffic later. All right, so if you guys want to take a picture of this, because I'm running over, I'm going to be funny. I do want to cover this. So everybody in the industry has been asking, how long should the passphrases be? I asked several cryptographers. I asked several pen testers. I went around and around. I came up with some answers. I'm accepting full responsibility for these answers. Nobody else wants to actually make a recommendation, so I'm going to make one. But the funniest thing happened. So I wrote this in the book. This is basically, it depends. It depends on what the attackers have in terms of testing equipment and how quickly they can initiate the attacks, what the capability of the AP they're attacking is. Because what I glossed over is, if you are attacking an SAE passphrase, it's an active brute force attack. It's not an offline dictionary attack. You can't do that. So you have to be connected and just brute forcing the passphrase. So one of my technical editors said, blah, 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 attack launched with 50 or 100 APs, haha, that's never actually really going to happen. And I had to add this because Mike Spicer was here. And I'm like, well, have you seen this guy? So that happened, and I told him yesterday, I was like, I have to add you in here now. So these are my recommendations for password links. It depends on how you're using it. What you'll notice that if you actually think you're using it for something secure, you're approaching the 20-character length down there. Complexity is less of a concern than length when it comes to passwords and passphrases these days. All right, I'm going to stop right there. Thank you guys so much. I'm happy to answer questions later. You've got your QR codes. Have fun, and thank you guys so much.